to The Kitchen Table, a show dedicated to helping you escape diet culture, gain trust with food, honor your body, and live a brighter life. Hello and welcome back to The Kitchen Table. I am so glad you're here. I'm your host, Alicia Brown, an anti-diet registered dietitian. And here we have Cherie today. I am so excited to have her on the podcast. She's at Food Freedom Therapist on Instagram. So get out your phones right now and follow Food Freedom Therapist. She has so much wisdom and insight to offer us at The Kitchen Table today. And also, while you have your phones out, hit subscribe to the show. Hit subscribe. And don't forget to rate and share this podcast on social media or wherever else you get your podcasts. Cherie, yes, she's a therapist. She's also walked the journey alongside with us. If you have struggles with food and body, she has too. And right now she is like paying it back. You know, she's been through it just as I have too. And so many of us in this profession have, but she's turned around and said, I'm going to lift other people up that are in the struggles too. So she is such a light in this space, and I'm just so excited to have her on. Cherie, would you just kindly introduce yourself and how you got into this work as a therapist that works with patients with eating disorders?
Yeah, for sure. And just real quick, it's actually pronounced Cherie.
Cherie. Cherie.
That is totally okay.
You told me that before the show.
Okay.
Cherie, thank you.
Like I said, I usually, if somebody knows how to pronounce it, and like you obviously know another Cherie because it's kind of an unusual name. So I don't think anything of it, but I knew you'd feel bad if I didn't say anything.
Exactly.
And later you were like, oh my gosh. So
thank you.
Worries. You're very welcome. No worries. Anywho, so as you mentioned, I am recovered myself, all through I guess really starting like the early part of college. I started struggling with some eating stuff, as it often does for people. I just started out with dieting, right? Quote unquote, harmless dieting. And then eventually progressed into an eating disorder. And so I know this isn't the point of the podcast, so I won't take up a lot of time talking about that, but eventually I did go through recovery. And then I thought I would go right into therapy work after I graduated college, and that did not work out. And so I ended up working in marketing, corporate marketing for 10 years. And I really loved a lot of things about it, but it was definitely not my passion. And I was really wanting to get back to this. And so when life circumstances worked out to where I could, when I was able to go back and get my master's, I started working on my master's, doing slowly one class at a time while I still kept my corporate job. And in between there, I got remarried and had a baby and moved back to Texas. So there was a lot, but you know what? We did it, and here we are. So now I'm so happy to be doing this work where I get to love the work that I do every day, and I'm so passionate about it. And yeah, like I mentioned earlier, it's still a journey. You know, it's not like I've arrived and everything is perfect as far as like food and body stuff, but I do feel like I've found healing, and I love sharing that with other people.
Amazing. What was the thing that prompted you to leave the corporate world and pursue a career back in intuitive eating and working with people that are struggling with food and body?
Yeah, I just got to a point where every day I'd sit at my desk and I was like, this is not meaningful to me. Mm-hmm. Even the aspects of my job that I liked, it just wasn't enough. I wanted something that I felt a lot of purpose about and could really feel excited about, to get out of bed in the morning and do the work that I do, and felt like I was making a difference. And I knew this was in my heart. It really had always been, and like I said, it's a story for another day, but of why that didn't work out for me to do that years earlier. And, I do think in a lot of ways it worked out the way it was supposed to, because I was not ready to be a therapist at 21, 22 years old and be helping people in this journey. I still had healing that I had to do more than I realized at the time. So I don't think I had enough maturity. I didn't have enough life experience, and I didn't have enough like food and body healing in myself yet to have been a good therapist back then. So I see God's hand in the timing of all that, even though it was tough for me, at times. I see how it really all worked out the way that it was supposed to. I'm just grateful to be here now.
I think that That's really impactful what you just said, that there's like a larger plan at play here and that God has a hand in all of our lives. It's a belief that I hold too. How did you get introduced to intuitive eating? I know that it's something that like I discovered like a decade after I was really struggling with disordered eating. And it's something that I feel, gosh, like if I only would have known of disordered eating, could it have saved me from so much pain and so much suffering if I just would have known this approach? And so I'm curious, like when you discovered it and if it helped you during your journey, or if it helped you later after when you discovered it.
Yeah, I would say I probably wouldn't have said in my recovery in college that I was familiar with intuitive eating. I have kind of an interesting story because I felt like I recovered in college. Now looking back, I would say it was kind of like a quasi recovery. If anybody is familiar with that term,
Sure.
it's kind of like I basically didn't have any eating disorder symptoms for a long time, for about 8 years to be exact. And then I went through a big life change and relapsed, which really threw me for a loop because, well, I'd been symptom free for 8 years. Now I understand that I didn't have behaviors, but I was still very much in diet mentality. I still had a lot of food rules, definitely the food police, still a lot of body shame that I had not worked through. And so I was very vulnerable to a relapse that I didn't see at the time. And so that's why I'm like, I was technically recovered. if you say like, if you base that on whether or not I had eating disorder symptoms, but I call that kind of a quasi recovery because it wasn't full food freedom. I definitely wasn't in a state of body acceptance like I am now.
It makes total sense when you're saying that like deeper healing with food and body needed to take place in order to feel even more recovered after you noticed a triggering event later in life led to that relapse. And you also mentioned earlier that like you're still doing this work. It's still not like you've arrived and now here you are all recovered. Like the work still continues, right? And I would say that same is so true for myself. I think there's like this misrepresentation that like you excel at intuitive eating and you've arrived at having this like positive, loving body image. And here you are just like loving yourself all day and posting photos of you naked on Instagram and like loving your body. Like, I just I don't think that's like the way. And I think that that's a really great thing to share is that like, there isn't a rival. The healing continues to work, but things in life can become less and less triggering to use food and body as a mechanism to cope.
Yes.
I feel like in your work, a lot of the clients that you work with are using food in a way to cope with emotions or to cope with the year that we've had. What are you seeing like in your practice right now, or maybe even with yourself through what we've all been through this year in regards to using food to cope with emotions or to cope with frustrations and anxieties in life?
Yeah, for sure. And I see that on both ends of the spectrum, right? I see people who are avoiding food as a way to try to gain a sense of control and, try to cope in that kind of way. And then I also see people who are struggling more on the other end of the spectrum where they're maybe doing more binge eating, things like that. And I do think it's coping at its core. It's just like a different way. It just looks different, but still using food to try to, feel okay and feel better and soothe emotions. And this has been, it's been quite a year for all of us, and I feel like I've, even for me, it's been such a challenging year, and I've really gone through the year relatively unscathed. I mean, there have been people who have lost significant jobs or homes or loved ones. I mean, that's big stuff, and even if you haven't gone through that, just the collective trauma of going through a global pandemic and how that's affected our economy and our day-to-day with working from home or trying to homeschool kids. I mean, this is just unprecedented. And I know that was kind of a catchphrase when this all started, but it really is true. We've all had to figure out what this looks like and adjust. And that's not easy, even for the most mentally healthy, most stable of us. I think that's really challenged and stretched, even those of us that were in a pretty good place, but certainly those who were already struggling.
I feel like, I so agree that there's like collective suffering in that, and that we've all kind of like taken a hit. And I feel like I've also like taken on a part-time job of trying to keep up with the news. Does anybody else feel that way? Like it's my like how many hours a week will I spend to like trying to keep up with like where's the vaccine at, and how are people feeling about this stuff? Like even keeping up with politics in regards to the coronavirus and everything else like that. That's all like impacting all of us. It's a lot of things that we're trying to like form opinions about and have something to stand on. How we navigate our daily lives. Like do we feel safe enough to go to the grocery store? Do we feel safe enough to eat in our homes? Thinking about if we feel safe enough in our bodies is a huge conversation when we don't maybe even feel safe enough going out into the world.
Yeah.
How do you feel about like this element of safety and security when it comes to our relationships with food and body, and maybe how that was like rocked for so many people this year?
Yeah, I think that has shown up in a lot of ways, because gosh, there are so many layers. You were talking about like the access to grocery stores and how that was difficult for a while, and even access to food, right? Because I know when I was doing grocery orders, there was a lot of things out of stock. There were a couple weeks where we couldn't find meat at stores. It's like, I think there was a period of what felt like food scarcity, which some people unfortunately experience on a pretty regular basis, but many of us are, privileged enough that we don't. And so there was that kind of element. Then of course, being at home and maybe, being around food more often than what we were used to. That I know that felt really unsafe and triggering for a lot of people to just be at home and be around food all day long and not have the structure of going to work and going to an office and having the routine.
Absolutely.
And of course, gosh, there's all this talk about quarantine weight. Like, don't get me started, but
we should dive into that even a bit. I know it's like, don't even get me started. Let's go there. Can we go there?
We can go there. I'm always happy to go there. I just don't know if people want me to get started on it because I can get really worked up about it because it's just so harmful. It's so wrong on multiple levels.
What exactly do you feel like is wrong about the concept of the quarantine weight gain? I'm hearing things like quarantine X number of pounds. I'm hearing things about making jokes about weight gained in quarantine, making jokes about not going on vacation with their families and how, thank God they're not, because they've, they're not feeling secure or confident in their bodies any longer. And that's a really personal thing to experience. And that's being talked about and joked about when really like at large, there's like this collective suffering that's happening. And of course, like it's impacting our bodies. Of course, like because our routines are all shaken up, that we have different relationships with food and body right now. Like, of course it's impacting our bodies, but how we're reacting to the pandemic and to life right now impacting our bodies, that's the thing that I'm experiencing right now, or that the thing that I'm seeing is really harmful. Our fat phobia that's coming to the surface, our vulnerability that's coming to the surface. Can you speak on that a little bit of what you're seeing kind of in the landscape right now or experiencing yourself?
Yeah, I just, I try to step back from, the part of me that's become quite social justice and feminist oriented and can get my righteous anger really, fired up pretty quick about this stuff. And remember, like so much of that is a reflection of the pain that individuals are feeling, in their bodies with
advocacy.
Yeah, exactly. And how complicated and weighty that really is, but it's just so harmful because, it, as you said, it just continues to perpetuate that fat phobia and send the message that you have to be thin to have value or to be able to take that vacation with your family or wear the swimsuit on the beach, whatever it is. And it also, it's just really sad to me that when we have all this going on in the world, I mean, we've had racial tension and forest fires and political unrest and a global pandemic. And here we are talking about weight, like that should even matter. That should even register on what we're concerned about right now. Is just really shows how fat phobic and weight biased we really are. Although at the same time, I also do think that goes back to a sense of control, because when everything else does seem out of control, perhaps, well, I can focus on, changing my diet a little bit or whatever I need to do to try to lose some weight to get back into those jeans that don't fit me right now.
Mm-hmm.
That also can give a sense of normalcy or a sense of control when everything else feels pretty out of control right now.
Yeah, I think so many of us can relate to that, like desire for control.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe for some of us, maybe for many of us listening, it's showed up in our wanting to control food or wanting to control the size of our bodies. I mean, that makes so much sense to want to like control something as personal as how we feed ourselves and how we feel in ourselves and in our bodies. Like, yes, or that control might be showing up in different ways. I know for myself, that control is just like, okay, how clean can I make my house?
Yeah.
How like, like the weirdest kind of like ways of like, okay, now I'm trying to like dictate like what my husband is doing and like, hey, did you like put that in the dishwasher? Right. Like we can't have the utensils like facing up, it's going to collect water. Like I don't, like it's showing up in different ways. Right. Like,
Yes.
so it's just something to be aware of, like how are we coping? How are we showing up in the world? And of course we're coping. And of course things might not feel right or feel normal. I think normalcy and routine give us a sense of that safety and security. And having that just rocked, of course, we're feeling more vulnerable and more insecure. And I think going into the new year, we are seeking like more safety, more security. A lot of us are looking for like hope in the new year that things are going to be better than this year. And along with that, we're going to have like compounded messages from diet culture of like, like not only is this year, like we're making this larger than life, it seems like 2021, we are making it larger than life. And we're saying not only is it going to be better than 2020, but like hop on the juice cleanse, go do this home workout. Like now we're going to have this like renewed sense of like this utopian 2021 because 2020 was such a cluster. Yeah. And so like, what message do you have to send to women who are like looking for a sense of hope in the new year, but are struggling so much with food and body right now that might feel so tempted by the diet or the next thing to like help them gain that sense of control and security in the new year?
Yeah, because I think what you said was so true as far as like the timing of this right now is tough because everything is kind of compounded. And this time of year would be tough even on a quote unquote normal year, right? Because of the holidays, which can be very challenging and triggering. And then leading into the new year where I know, I hate it. It's like, I don't even want to watch TV at all that first month. Yes, because there's so many diet ads and ads for weight loss and gym memberships and, all that kind of really toxic diet and fitness culture stuff that is just really mind numbing. But like you said, this year on top of that, we have everything of 2020 and all the weight of that and leading into this, like, it's almost like we want to hit reset in so many ways, once January 1st hits. I've even had to tell myself like, okay, check your expectations. When January 1st comes around, it doesn't mean that suddenly everything is going to be different or better. It's going to be a slow process of things and I don't even say getting back to normal because I don't know that we'll ever get back to quote unquote normal, like what we knew before. And in some ways that might be really sad. In some ways it could be a good thing. Yeah. And I guess for me, that's helpful and looking for what are the gifts out of what we've been going through, are going through. What are the good things? How can we, be healthier in how we cope with the things that are really challenging and tough and be honest and vulnerable about that and get the support we need. And at the same time, take advantage of what is good about this time, because I look back at other seasons of my life and I think, man, I really didn't take advantage of what I was going through at the time because I was so focused on all that was going wrong. I think about even when I went into recovery in my eating disorder, I was studying abroad actually. I was over in England at Oxford University when I was kind of confronted with like, oh, I have an eating disorder. It's a real problem, and kind of started recovery. And in some ways I'm like, man, that sucked because I didn't get to do some of the traveling and, but somehow I was like, man, it was a gift because I'm not sure I would have gone into recovery if I'd just been a normal semester on my usual campus. There was a lot of reasons why it was, I was confronted with the reality being overseas. So I think that's a great example of like everything can, every challenging season, you can look for what the gifts are. What are the good things that I can take out of this? What are the ways that I'm growing and becoming better?
150 million%. In my Let Your Body Lead professional certification training, we talked about the differences in like contraction versus expansion. Contraction being like when we feel like something is really wrong going on in our life, like when we're feeling constantly in a state of maybe fight or flight or tension or anger, and how that shows up in the body is kind of like maybe a tight feeling in the guts, or like just that, that kind of like instinctual, intuitive feeling of like something is off, something is not right. I'm speaking to all of the women out there, especially maybe also if you have children that are like, okay, something is not right. And, like that feeling can be a very contractive feeling. And that's something that like, if we lean into the bodies and the wisdom that our body has to give us in the realm of intuitive eating, it's just like, okay, how can I honor my body right now? How can I honor the circumstance that's happening in my life right now and how I treat myself and therefore how I treat other people? And that's where I see what you're saying of like that silver lining is like, oh, I've learned all of these new things about myself. What have we learned about ourselves this year in the ways that we cope? What have we learned about ourselves this year in the ways that like the things that we need as like a human being throughout all of this chaos that's going on? We need love and relationships. We need connection. We need someone to hold space for us so we can fully show up, right? So I encourage anybody that's listening to this right now, like, what have you learned for yourself this year, and like what you need as a human, because that is what's going to carry us into next year and into facing all of like those diet culture messages that say like, oh, skinnier is better in the new year, because that's a full out attack as well.
Yes.
And so when you said, oh my gosh, I don't even want to listen to anything for the first month, it's because you want to protect yourself from all of that messaging.
Yeah. And it just makes me really mad. And I end up yelling at the TV, and my husband is very tolerant of like my antics, whether it's a weight loss thing or like eye creams for women. And I'm like, oh, you don't have to look for 20 forever. He lets me do my thing. But, that whole first month, there's quite a bit of that. And I'm like, it's easier for me to just turn the TV off. But yeah. And, I just want to clarify too, that doesn't mean that we have to have this like, positive thinking, like just pretend everything is good. And, like only positivity. Yeah. And exactly. That toxic positivity. It's definitely not that. It's just, I do a lot of DBT work. I don't know if you're familiar with that, dialectical behavior therapy, but one of the concepts of that is that you can hold two things that seem opposite at the same time. And so for me, I think gratitude is a great example of that. You can hold gratitude at the same time. You can acknowledge and even, like you said earlier, lean into those feelings of, this is really hard. This is really uncomfortable. I'm not really enjoying this, whatever that is, those things can be held at the same time. We're just not good at that, especially those of us that struggle with eating stuff. We tend to be very black and white, all or nothing thinkers. So it's like, I know I've had to work really hard on myself, and I help clients work on it. It's like, when we get in those feelings, we want to just like wrap them around us like a big giant blanket. And it's just like, then we want to sit and think about everything else that is wrong, so we can just be sad and
in our misery.
Right. And it's like, let's find the balance between with that, where you're like really just owning your misery, right? And you're just kind of stewing in it versus like sitting in your feelings, not trying to avoid them through exercise or through binging or through restriction, right? Like recognize, sit with your feelings, give yourself a chance to feel them, process them, but you don't necessarily have to sit and stay in them 24/7 either, right? Like you can get out and decide you're going to do something that feels good to your body or connect with somebody so you feel, poured into by somebody that you care about or whatever that looks like for you.
Absolutely. It's like, how can we get ourselves out of that downward spiral of misery? I love that. First, it's like you can recognize that you can hold other emotions other than just the miserable emotions at the same time. You can be feeling totally miserable and also have a sense of gratitude for something in your life. You can hold both of those things. Like, I think that's a really great thought. Another thing is like what you're saying about like reaching out to somebody, knowing that you're not alone in your experience. These can be something that brings you back up into what I alluded to earlier, which is like the window of tolerance, where we feel like a functional human that's able to do all of the things that we want to do in the course of a day rather than wrapping up in our blanket of misery like so many of us do. And of course we do, again, because of all of what we're experiencing. But how we get out of that and how we make our way out of that can be something that's feeling really supportive or something that's continuing that downward spiral. And of course, sometimes it's food and body stuff, but also food can actually be the thing that gets us back into feeling like ourselves too.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Cherie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's such a connection about nourishing ourselves, physically through food as well as emotionally. And, and I'm not necessarily talking about emotional eating, although I don't think it's been fairly portrayed as far as, emotional eating is not always a bad thing. I think the way I describe it to clients is if that's your only way of coping or you do it all the time, then it's out of balance, and we kind of need a toolbox of ways to take care of ourselves, because different tools will work at different times, for different people, that kind of thing. And so I'm like, but I don't think it's unfair to say that, emotional eating is okay sometimes, because sometimes when it's cold outside, a bowl of chicken noodle soup that's warm or, whatever it is for you.
Yeah.
It just sounds so good. Or a mug of like really warm cocoa. My kids last night had hot chocolate. For my daughter, she's almost 2. It was her first experience with hot cocoa. And I will say it was a success, seeing as how she basically downed it.
She loved
I was trying
it.
to get on her bib and she wouldn't put down her cup so I could get down her bib. And she was going, like pulling her head away so she could keep drinking it, and it's like, you think about how we celebrate, at birthday parties and anniversaries or even at funerals, a lot of times there's food served in the person's home after, right? Like, and you see that across cultures. So it's not that food shouldn't be tied to emotion. I don't think that is actually, I don't think it's realistic and I don't think it's necessarily healthy. But, I find people, from a just very purely biological point, like if they're going through periods of restriction, like we're not going to feel good physically or emotionally, right? Like that stresses the body out. We're going to be more apt to be hangry, to be irritable, which again is already kind of a challenge right now with everything that's going on, I think. And so properly nourishing yourself in a way where you're eating consistently and sufficiently. And that's how I kind of phrase it to clients, that's the goal.
It is the goal because feeling satisfied is like a gateway to feeling more comfortable and confident in our bodies. I so feel,
Absolutely.
to give us safety and security. We can find that in a feeling of fullness and satisfaction, whether it be mentally, physically, or emotionally, or hopefully all of those things, right?
Yes.
So what a power of food that it can give us in that way. And also there are other tools in the toolbox. If food's not the thing, that's going to feel most supportive right now, and exploring those options too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, that feels so nourishing. That feels to me like a warm blanket, as you were saying, not the blanket of misery, but the blanket of just like, oh, hygge, like this fireplace, warm, hot chocolate kind of feeling I'm getting right now.
I know that makes me want to like turn up the heater, or like go get a blanket or something.
Oh, cozy up, right? We want to feel cozy and comfortable and nourished.
Exactly.
I feel that way with you right here at the kitchen table, Cherie.
Oh, well, thank you.
Do you have any last advice for women that are really struggling in their relationships with food and body, entering the holidays, that are feeling like, okay, in the new year, I'm going to tighten everything up. I'm going to lose that X number of pounds and I'm going to get quote unquote healthy. I think so many of us listening are in that mindset, but we're also open to knowing if there's a different way, because we've done this before and it hasn't worked before. And so what can you offer to them? Like, do you have any like pieces of wisdom or advice to maybe offer to get out of like a dieting cycle and jump into the intuitive eating paradigm?
Yeah, I would say two things, from a practical food standpoint, just recognizing when those diety thoughts pop up for you and just realize like, okay, it just means that I need to keep working on giving myself unconditional permission to eat, right? Because when we don't, we really are setting ourselves up for things being complicated or for binging later. And so, starting to really make sure that you're seeing food as neutral, that one food is not good, it's not bad. One's not better than the other. If somebody's not doing work with an intuitive eating professional, I highly recommend that if that's within your resources. If not, getting the book and the workbook, those are, maybe more affordable options and a great place to start. Mm-hmm. And so the other thing is, I think boundaries are really important, and I'm a big boundary nerd. I know maybe you are too. Like, I know this is a podcast, so people can't see, but you're like dancing.
I'm like, my shoulders go with the word boundaries. I start like doing this like really juicy like shoulder move. That sounds really nice.
So important. Boundaries are so important, and I do so much boundary work with clients, and because that really goes across the spectrum. It is much broader than just food and body stuff. Yeah. But so what this looks like right now, I think for the holidays, is recognizing, what are triggers for you? And maybe that is a certain person, that might be a holiday function or a family member you might be having to spend some time with. So what would it look like to put in boundaries for that person? Does it maybe mean speaking up for yourself and drawing a line of like, what, I don't really appreciate comments on my body and I don't want to talk about my weight, or please don't make comments about what I'm eating. I trust my body to choose what feels good to me. Maybe you aren't at a place where you can speak up, or, sometimes people are too toxic, and standing up for yourself will actually make the problem worse. So maybe it just, it means maybe avoiding that person and finding a way to excuse yourself from the conversation, or take a walk outside, or text a friend like, oh my gosh, you'll never believe what my aunt so-and-so said, or, whatever it is, having somebody on backup to be your support when you need to vent about whatever's going on.
That's great.
But I also think it can mean boundaries with, what we're taking in as far as like social media. And like I said, sometimes I just turn the TV off for a while, because we're just really going to be getting those messages from everywhere. And the way our brains work, the more we see images, the more we hear messages, that shapes our beliefs and our thoughts. And so it's really important to be careful about what we're letting our brains consume, right? So being intentional about not looking and listening to all that stuff. And also then filling the void with really positive messages, like immerse yourself in body positive, intuitive eating social media, or books, or podcasts like this one.
Nice.
Right? Because I think that makes a difference. I mean, for myself, I saw so much growth. And I would say in about a year where I just immersed myself completely. I mean, I read as many books, started on social melike, listened to as many podcasts, may have been dubbed a podcast junkie. That's okay. I've been called worse things, so like just really immerse myself and detoxed everything else. Like that is a detox I do recommend.
Woo! The detox from garbage on social media.
Yes. From diet culture detox. Yes.
Yeah.
And it made such a difference. And I've seen it make such a difference for my clients who are really willing to go all in on that kind of thing. Because it's not just, it sounds good in theory, but it's more than that. Again, it really changes how our brains are shaped, right? It changes the neurons in our brain, how they fire, and the neural pathways that we use. So also kind of a brain nerd with all that neuroplasticity stuff, but it changes our brain. So like there's science behind it. And so those would be my two takeaways that I would offer people, is to, just keep coming back to the intuitive eating principles as much as you need to, knowing that it's a process, and it's also okay if you're struggling. You can keep moving forward even when you're struggling. And also, what would be some healthy boundaries?
So supportive. once we set boundaries, it's just like, oh my God, I can reclaim my life. This is like a ripple effect of like, oh my gosh, I get to like fashion my own reality in a way, right? Of like what feels safe and comfortable for me. It really mimics our whole conversation today about feeling safe and secure in our bodies and confident with food again. You know, we can protect ourselves. And I think that's something that we're all looking for this year as we go into the new year. So we can like really face those dieting messages with some armor. So we can feel protected
absolutely.
and, you know, so we can still really feel like we can live out our journey to rediscovering our intuitive eater.
Yes, I love that.
This has been so powerful.
I've loved it. I'm like, I think you asked me back. I could talk about boundaries. We could talk like, I love boundaries so much.
We will have you back to talk about boundaries, and you're welcome to the kitchen table whenever you'd like. Cherie, it's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure. As we wrap up today, can you share where people can find you? They already know and they've already followed you, as I hope they all did when I mentioned at the first portion of the show, like pull out your phones and follow Cherie at Food Freedom Therapist on Instagram.
Yes.
Where else can they find you and connect with you?
I also have my website, so that's just foodfreedomtherapy.com. And I have a newsletter. People can sign up. I'm still kind of figuring out what that looks like.
Cool.
Like I said earlier before we started, I'm kind of coming back into private practice. It hasn't even been quite a year yet since being on extended maternity leave. So everything's looking a little kind of different, and I'm figuring it out. But I hope everybody will go on this journey with me as we all kind of figure it out, right? Like, that's why I love we can just be honest. Like, I don't have it all figured out. I don't know exactly what's going on with my business all the time. I don't always know what's going on with how I'm parenting my children. You know, sometimes my husband and I have to sit down and come to some come to Jesus meetings about like, this isn't working. Let's figure it out. You know, I'm all about modeling like vulnerability of like, we're just figuring it out. So come join me on Instagram or my newsletter and tell me what you think, what you want to hear about, because
wonderful.
I'm here to help. So let's have some dialogues. I love that. I mentioned that too before we started. Like, I'm loving being on Instagram, even though I joined kicking and screaming.
There was some resistance, but now you're here and it's fun.
Yes. And now I'm like, oh man, I wish I'd done this sooner, because I'm just connecting with so many amazing people. It's been so good for me in my own journey. And it's just so fun to see that this is a big growing community. We feel crazy sometimes because diet culture is so pervasive, but this really is a growing movement. I mean, I was not doing this 5 years ago. You probably were not either. Here we are. So it feels small, but we're growing and we're here to stay.
Oh yeah, we're growing and we're here to stay.
Yeah.
Come join the club here at the kitchen table and on social media. Set those boundaries, fill your brain with goodness, wrap yourself up in that cozy supportive blanket as you're drinking your hot chocolate by the fireplace with all of the body positive, intuitive eating messages that you need to keep you safe and secure going into the new year. Cherie, we'll have you back to talk about boundaries soon.
Thank you. I would love it.
So much for coming to the kitchen table today.
Well, thank you so much for asking me. It truly was an honor. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And for everyone listening, come back to Monday's episode for the final episodes of the Food Joy series going on throughout the new year. And yes, we will talk soon. Enjoy the day.